So yeah, hi there, everybody. My name's Peter Powell. I am the CEO of the Welsh Dee Trust. The Welsh Dee Trust, we are the Rivers Trust for the River Dee in North Wales and Chester. Our objective as an organisation is a River Dee which is free of pollution and full of wildlife. We really see ourselves as a charity that wants to get our feet wet, get our hands dirty, and sort of get out there and make the tangible differences on the ground, and be the people that go out there and actually try and fix the problem. And so today, this webinar, I'm going to talk about sort of one of the major pollutants and one of the major problems that's coming up in the River Dee. It's probably of quite sort of national importance for a whole lot of reasons, and that's phosphorus. Or phosphate. So yeah, I'm just going to launch into it. Oh, there's more people joining. Excellent. So phosphorus is a chemical element. It's found naturally in the universe. It's found most commonly in the form of phosphate. So combined with oxygen, phosphorus and makes phosphate. It's a important chemical and important nutrient for plant growth, for river ecosystems, for a whole load of different reasons. And it's found naturally. You do get so it is also an important nutrient that we use in agriculture, and through human actions we have taken quite a lot of extra phosphate from mine sources across the world, use them as fertilizer, and so we've changed the phosphorus balance of the entire planet. This has shown up in lots of ecosystems, but particularly is probably most noticeable in water ecosystems and river ecosystems. And when you get excess amounts of phosphorus within a river, that quite severely disrupts the ecology of the river. So for the River Dee, to take it as an example, phosphorus would have been the limiting factor to algal growth within the river. So additional phosphorus basically fertilizes the river, means you get a lot of extra algal growth. That algal growth can then disrupt the ecology of the river. It can suck oxygen out of the water. It can smother the ground, the gravels and the base of the river. In the absolute sort of worst case scenarios, you get what's called an algal bloom, and this is where basically the water turns green because you get this huge, a massive amounts growth of phosphorus, which causes the algae to just grow out of control, and you get an algal bloom. So this is an image from Llyn Tegid. So this is the main river in Snowdonia National Park, a very low nutrient ecosystem naturally. Huge, additional phosphorus in the summer of 2023, combined the excess phosphorus plus high water temperatures caused quite big chunks of the lake to turn green due to that. There's lots of different sources of phosphorus, which I'll cover in this webinar, but really, looking at we use it to fertilize food, and then it comes through in our food and therefore through into our manures. That's both livestock manure, but also human manure, sewage. But it's also used in other processes. It's used in a lot of cleaning products, and it's actually also added to drinking water as a way of reducing contamination from lead pipes. So it's a chemical that's used quite widely throughout business, human activities, I guess is the term I'm looking for. So River Dee and Llyn Tegid is a special area of conservation. This means it's special for its wildlife, and because of that, it's got different targets for all of the sort of damaging chemicals or damaging activities which could impact the wildlife of the river. One of those is phosphorus, and so the river does have targets for phosphorus. These have always historically been in place since it was a special area of conservation, first assigned. But in 2016 in Holland, there was a court case that looked at nitrogen and identified that nitrogen was having a big impact on watercourses within Holland, and so that led to a review of targets within the UK, and that meant quite a lot of the targets were made much tighter. So all of the targets of the River Dee were tightened in 2016, and this has had quite a severe impact on development plans. Because of special area conservation, you have to do a habitat assessment. You have to show that any new plans will not impact the designation or impact the special area conservation. If you are to do that, you need to, so for the D, things like the Wrexham Local Development Plan had to put in places actions to make sure that there was no additional phosphorus going into the river, which is quite a challenging thing to do. So the River Dee has some failures. Some of the water bodies, some of the sections of the River Dee are failing its targets for phosphorus, but the ones that aren't failing are still very close to failing. So it's a river that's it's not got phosphorus issues in the same way as, say, the Wye, which I think has got quite a few water bodies failing, but it is very close to that limits of and in some places too much phosphorus is getting into the river. It's therefore really, really important that we work out a way to essentially identify and fix the sources of the excess phosphorus which is making itself into the river. The aim is to bring the special area into compliance. I think ultimately everyone would like to see it not just be at the targets and be compliant with the targets, but be below the targets to give some sort of wriggle room to make sure it's wriggle room for future development, future changes, climate change, changes in land use, to make sure that that special area conservation in the River Dee does stay below that below those targets. So there is lots of different sources of phosphorus and lots of different pathways. The way I like to think of it and the way we consider sort of pollution at Welsh Dee Trust is we split everything down into a source and a pathway. So a source of pollution is essentially where the pollution is coming from. That would be the livestock manure, that could be human sewage, that could be the toothpaste, you find it in toothpaste, that could be the stuff that's added to lead pipes to reduce it. And then we also like to think of the pathways, and so that's the way that the phosphorus is making its way from the manure, from the source into the watercourse. And so we break it down into, for clarity, we essentially break phosphorus down into 3 core sources, which is agriculture, sewage, and the built environment. And then each one of those, we've got different pathways for how the phosphorus is getting from those sources into the river. And that's what I'll sort of go through today. Obviously, the biggest question, and the question I get asked a lot, is how we can identify the sources and identify the pathways by which it's making its way into the water. But the big challenge is trying to work out what the quantity of each source is, and how it is, which one is the biggest source of phosphorus. Obviously, this is a really important question if you're trying to reduce the amount. You want to focus on the biggest sources, but it is a very difficult question to ask. The main difficulty being it's quite hard to measure, mostly because it's constantly changing. You have a variety of sources and a variety of pathways. Those levels that's come from each one is changing almost constantly, depending on the weather, depending on sort of individual business decisions by farms, by water companies, by other people, depending on accidents that people have taken, illegal discharges where people have poured stuff down a drain by accident. Suddenly one place might be full of phosphorus because someone's poured something down a drain, but that might be a one-off. So it is very difficult to identify exactly what is the sort of biggest contributor of phosphorus into the river. There's been sort of 2 main attempts on the Dee to try and identify, to try and break it down and to give us some sort of idea of what they would be. So Dŵr Cymru with NRW used some modelling and did some stages modelling. Essentially, they took their data of what they knew was coming out of the sewage treatment works of phosphorus. They compared that to water sampling of the river, and they worked out what their percentage was coming from sewage treatment works. And from that, they modelled what could be coming from other sources. Roughly, it works out at sort of 45% from sewage, 45% from agriculture, and sort of 10% from other sources. That will fluctuate, obviously. It will fluctuate from month to month, year to year. And I think one of the challenges, even that's based on data that was taken in 21, 22, I think. So already, you know, it's a changing picture. There's a lot has changed in 2022. The weather, the you know, businesses, everything has changed. So it's probably already a little bit out of date, that thing, but it does give us a broad idea of what the sort of larger sources are. To try and tackle this problem, we have a citizen science scheme at Welsh Dee Trust. We've got 40 odd citizen scientists, I think, at the moment, who go out and do walkover surveys for us, where they monitor phosphorus levels using phosphate strips as a sort of cheap way of getting an idea of phosphorus. So they do that across a variety of sites, and that allows us to sort of compare site to site and come up with an idea of where phosphorus is higher within the catchment. It's very much a quantity-based approach. It's not super accurate, but it is very good for that sort of very broad picture of where in the catchment the phosphorus is coming from. And it's very useful, and the main tool we use it for is actually focusing, identifying where the actual pathway is entering into the river. So it's really good at helping us find the actual pipe or the overland flow or the discharge that is high in phosphorus. And because that works, because the citizen scientist is taking samples along a river, and if they take it at 3 sites, and then you get a high reading going upstream, you get a high reading, and then a low reading, you can identify that the source or the pathway for phosphorus is coming from between those 2 places that I've taken the reading. And then from that, I can you can hone it down until eventually you find the pipe or the source or the pathway that phosphorus is making into the watercourse. And then that's really useful, because once you've identified that, you can start that process of trying to fix whatever that source is, if it is possible to fix. So we at Welsh Dee Trust have, we've got our citizen scientists, we've got 6 members of staff who've done a lot of work out and about on the catchments, looking at pollution sources. We've broken down, as I said, into 3 main sources: agriculture, sewage, built environment. And underneath that, we've then identified maybe 10 or 11 in total pathways that we talk about, where the source of the phosphorate and how it's actually getting from the source into the watercourse. And so in this, I'm just going to go through each of the sources and each of those pathways that will hopefully be useful. So for agriculture, we essentially talk about 3 main pathways. The main sources of so agriculture we call the main source, but really that is livestock manure or chemical fertilizers. They're the 2 sort of main sources within agriculture of where the phosphorus is coming from. And then we talk about sort of 3 main pathways for how that's getting from the farm into watercourses. The first one is sort of direct from livestock. It's pretty straightforward. If you have livestock out in the field, so this is cattle, sheep to a lesser extent, potentially chickens if they're out in the field, I guess. If they are standing in a watercourse all day and doing their business, that is a pretty direct route, direct pathway for phosphorus or manure slurry getting straight into the watercourse. That's livestock standing in the river, but also livestock standing near river and congregating near river. So we have found quite regular occasions where ring feeders or farm tracks where they go over bridges, particularly. Obviously, around those areas, in those feeding areas, you can get a lot of livestock standing. The soil underneath can become quite poached, quite heavily poached. There's obviously there can be quite a large buildup of manure in that areas. If that's near to a watercourse, that can quite easily just sort of spill over into the watercourse, and that's a pretty common pathway. Currently, you are allowed livestock to enter watercourses. I'd say in a lot of cases, low-level grazing can be really important for grassland and riparian species diversity. But it is a challenge where you have more larger groups of livestock and more intensive farming activities where you have more livestock that can really start to have an impact. The solution is pretty simple, really, and that's sort of fencing livestock out of watercourses. We do a lot of this at Welsh Dee Trust. Most of our focus is doing it from a habitat restoration point of view to try to manage the grazing better so that you can get tree growth alongside rivers. But it does also have probably a big impact on water quality and the amount of phosphorus that gets into the river. And so then the second pathway, and I think actually this is probably, in our experience, one of the bigger pathways for phosphorus getting into rivers. I think it's probably one of the sort of underestimated ones, and that's direct from the farmyard. When I say direct from the farmyard, I'm really thinking of essentially it's manures, livestock manures, possibly artificial fertilizers, but mostly livestock manures, essentially getting into a clean water drain on the farmyard. That clean water drain goes directly to a watercourse, and so you've got that flow of manure from the farmyard straight to the watercourse. This is what sort of one example. Obviously, a completely perfect farmyard and a completely perfect system on a farmyard would have clean and dirty water separations. All the clean water on the farmyard, so all the rainwater or the roof water, would be completely separate, enter a clean water drain and go to a watercourse where it stays clean and is discharged away into watercourse cleanly. You will have clean yards on a farmyard where livestock don't stand, but where cars are parked, where machinery is parked. There might be occasional very light traffic of livestock moving across that area. They legally they can also discharge straight to a watercourse, and that could be a source of pollution. But what we're finding mostly is actually where heavily trafficked areas of livestock poaching livestock loafing areas, areas where livestock are standing, dirty yards. Still, the runoff from those yards is getting into clean water drains. This is covered by the SAFO regulations, but we're finding probably compliance with these regulations can be pretty low. So this is one example on your screen of what sort of thing I'm talking about. This is a dairy farm. On the other side of that, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the other side of that green gate is the area where the cattle are standing to come into the parlour. So they're standing there twice a day, standing around waiting to come into the parlour. The majority of the slurry and the manure from this area is running backwards, away from where we're stood, away from where the photographer was stood, and is running down into the slow lagoon. It's being collected in the slow lagoon, and then it'll be spread onto the fields as fertilizer, which is the sort of perfect system that we're aiming for. But unfortunately, you can see some of it is actually coming underneath the gate and flowing across this clean yard, which you can see in the photo, and into this drain in front of us, which is a clean water drain. And on the left hand side, you can see the discharge of that drain, which was going into a field and is running across the field at this for 10 meters, then into a ditch. The ditch is carrying it to a brook, which would then carry it down into the river. In this case, it was a pretty simple fix, and Welsh Dee Trust, we worked with the farmer to put in the solution, which was essentially raising up this area and putting in a concrete bund underneath the gate so that the slurry flowed in the opposite direction away from the gate and was all collected. We also put in guttering on this building, new guttering on this building to collect all the rainwater so that the rainwater could come onto the clean yards and into the clean water drain, also making the loafing area where the cattle were standing easier to manage, because he was essentially producing less slurry, so it was easier to manage and it was less likely to run under the yard. This is pretty common sort of small things that we find like this. Ultimately, a lot of farmyards were built and designed back in a long time ago, before clean water, dirty water separation was such an important issue. They're probably designed when we had fewer livestock on the farmyard, and so it's possibly less of an issue. But as times have changed and livestock numbers per farm have gone up, it's become quite a big issue. And I think this is probably quite a significant pathway and source for phosphorus pollution into the River Dee. And then the final main pathway from agriculture we talk about is from overland flows. Excuse me. So essentially, livestock manure collected, it's pretty valuable fertilizer. You know, the farming system relies on us fertilizing the crops or the grass to grow so that we can harvest them and take it away to feed ourselves. What is happening is that process whereby manures are being spread onto a field or onto a field, some of the manure or some of the phosphorus is then getting into the watercourses. That's either happening because of bad practice during spreading. So that's bad weather, particularly, of which we've had a lot recently. The spreading during bad weather, you then get, if you get a lot of rainfall onto a freshly spread field, the water that's running off the top of the field will carry some of that manure, some of that slurry with it. It'll be high in phosphorus and it will make its way into a watercourse. The other way that it's making its way is that there's essentially too much phosphorus or manure being added to the field, much more being added to the field than the crops need to grow. And so then you get leaching down through the soil, and that comes out in sort of either the land drains or can go through the groundwater and start to appear in springs and things coming from the field. Essentially, this is happening where there's more manure, more slurry needed than the farm needs. You are obviously, if you have something like a poultry shed or quite an intensive dairy farm, or you are bringing in a lot of feed onto the farm to feed your livestock, you are always importing phosphorus onto the farm. And if you are just spreading that manure onto your own fields or onto nearby fields, you have got a net gain of phosphorus coming onto the farm. Eventually, that could lead to this leaching out through watercourses. The big challenges of this, I think, are making sure fields are soil sampled, making sure that we're applying the right amounts that the crops need to grow, making sure we have enough storage, particularly with dairy farms. Is quite a key one, is making sure there's enough storage for particularly slurry, so that you don't have to spread it during bad weather. In Wales, the requirement is from August will be for 5 months storage. I think we've had 5 months of pretty solid rain now. So you can see how important that 5 months of storage is. And I think we're still finding quite a lot of farms that have nowhere near that sort of level of storage. Obviously, the big challenge is that storage is very expensive. And I would say there's not been enough money in the system to allow not enough money for being paid to farms for their produce to allow them to invest in what is quite expensive infrastructure on farms. And I think that's really starting to come to a head now, that a lot of farmyards have had a lack of investment over maybe the last 20-30 years. because there's not been enough money in the system, I would argue. I've got to touch on soil health because I think this is really key to when we're talking about overland flows of phosphorus, or phosphorus going down through leaching down through into groundwater or into land drains. A healthy soil will be able to store more water. You'll get less runoff, and also you'll get better nutrients uptake from the crops. So if we can have, this is a compacted soil, and this is a sort of uncompacted soil. The more uncompacted and healthier our soils are, the more tolerant they are to having phosphorus put on them. Means we're less likely to get phosphorus lost from the fields into watercourses from that sort of from heavy rainfall or accidents. So for Welsh Dee Trust, we have a water-wise farming program. This is we provide advice and support for free to farms to help them tackle some of these issues. That takes that looks like we do what's called a technical farmyard assessment, where we essentially help a farm identify where they're compliant on the farm with clean water drains, where they can make improvements to stop pollution coming from the farmyard, and then we grant funds to help make those improvements. Or what is most useful, actually, I think, for most farms is we just manage the project. So we manage the contractors to come and do the repairs or do the changes to the farmyard that makes those differences. We also then do soil health improvements. So we help farms with soil health advice, and then we provide some grant funding to trial new ideas. So things like sward lifting, herbal layers to try and help improve soil health. And then also a big part of our work is trying to bring farmers together so that they can learn from each other. I think this is probably one of the most important things that we can do. It's really good where farmers having success with a scheme or an intervention or some sort of change to their business to help them spread the word so that other farms can also learn off each other. We find that really, really positive. So we have a 5-year strategy at Welsh Dee Trust with targets that we want to achieve by 2027. So we have our target is to help essentially 85 farms fix their farmyards. We want to try and help improve 1,800 acres of soil. We want to lead on 33 peer-to-peer learning events. And we want to set up 5 farm clusters around specific tributaries where we know there's an issue, so that those farms can work together to try and tackle the problem. Also, we do have a Restoring River Habitats program, which as part of that, we've got a target to improve 40 kilometres of riparian habitat. A big part of that will be fencing watercourses and removing livestock. So the main driver of that's not pollution, but I think it is probably going to have a big impact on it will have an impact on the amount of phosphorus finding its way into the river. Excellent. And so then what I would say is the other major source, as I said before, it's sort of 45% from agriculture, 45% sewage within the River Dee, roughly, for phosphorus making its way into the watercourse. So sewage is the other major source of phosphorus into the river. We at Welsh Dee Trust essentially break that down, and I think there's essentially 3 main pathways that phosphorus and sewage is making its way into the river. So the first one is septic tanks. Septic tanks, essentially, if you don't know, any house, any sort of rural house or rural business that's not near a main sewer will have to have some sort of private sewage treatment system. That normally looks like a septic tank, or you can get sort of much smaller enclosed treatment systems, which are much like a water company's treatment system, but enclosed and smaller, private. These are probably quite a significant source of phosphorus. It's hard to know exactly, but we at Welsh Dee Trust do regularly find discharges from septic tanks into tributaries, into watercourses, into ditches. Normally we identify them by sewage fungus, which means that there's essentially quite high levels of nutrients or biological oxygen demand coming from what's being discharged into the water, and we can link that back to the septic tank. What we're sort of regularly finding is that a septic tank does need maintenance. They need to be emptied once a year. They need to be desludged. Even a private sewage treatment work still needs quite a bit of maintenance. And what we're finding is where we're finding the discharges, it's where the maintenance hasn't been done, and that's usually because the people who need to do it have no idea that septic tanks do need maintenance. We also, do a lot of events. We do a lot of community events. We go to stands at village shows and talk to a lot of people. I'd say it's quite a common conversation we have about septic tanks, where people don't realise that their septic tank needs emptying. Under regulation now, septic tanks aren't allowed to discharge to watercourses. Only private sewage treatment systems are allowed to discharge to watercourses. But that came in within the last 2 decades. I think about 10 years ago, off the top of my head. I have to look up the exact date. But I think there's probably still also a lot of old septic tanks out there which are discharging directly into. I seem to have gone very purple, but I'll carry on. That are directly discharging into watercourses. So I think there's, I don't know how much of the total proportion of phosphorus is coming from septic tanks, and it'd be very hard to work that out. But what we are finding is, because they're in rural areas tucked away, we can find very small streams where the main discharge can be one septic tank, which is failing, not being maintained correctly, is out of date, and that's what's can cause quite severe impact on that one tributary, because those tributaries tend to be sort of rural tributaries tucked away. That means it can be the only discharge essentially onto that river, and that's why it can have really quite a significant impact on a sort of localized events, but maybe not so much on a whole river catchment. So then the other major source of sewage, so most houses will be on main sewage, which means that the water company will be paid to take away their sewage effluent. So this is Five Fords, which I think this is the largest sewage treatment system. This takes majority of the sewage from Wrexham. Sewage treatment works, there's a whole variety of different sizes, from quite small rural ones to very large permanent. Well, they're all permanent, but very large operations that take whole cities with permanent staff that work there full time, and quite a lot of processes involved within them and effort. So sewage treatment works essentially takes sewage. It then processes the sewage, and what it does is it strips the pollutants out of the sewage, and then you get a discharge of water that goes back into the watercourse at the end. So for phosphorus, that's stripped partly through the primary treatment, where the sludge is allowed to settle out of the sewage. This removes some of the phosphorus, and then there's a secondary process that's uses bacteria to break down a lot of the other nasties that are in the sewage. And then in a lot of cases, in some cases, there is a tertiary process, and this is where chemical salts are added to the sewage to cause the phosphate to solidify and settle out again. So there's 3 processes, and each one of those will take out some levels of phosphorus. And then the clean water is discharged out into a watercourse. It is a permitted discharge. Previously, not all the discharges had a permit limit for phosphorus, but with the changes in the targets on the DE now, every single sewage treatment works discharge does have a target for phosphorus. It varies from site to site about what is acceptable. And then it's for the water companies to ensure that the phosphorus doesn't go over that permitted level, and that for the government agency, either Natural Resources Wales or the Environment Agency, to enforce and make sure that water companies are making sure that discharge isn't going over that limit. This treated effluent, the phosphorus from the treated effluent is probably one of the biggest sources of it's one of the biggest sources of phosphorus within the River Dee. There's less than 50 sewage treatment works across the Dee, each one with one pipe that puts out this effluent. It's one business. It's Dŵr Cymru that owns all the sewage treatment works on the River Dee. So this would be, I think, the largest single contributor and single pathway for phosphorus making its way into the River Dee. But it is quite heavily permitted, and so it's probably one of the more controlled routes. The phosphorus, it's worth saying, the phosphorus that is stripped from the sewage. So you get what's called a sewage sludge at the end. That is obviously very high in phosphorus because the primary, secondary, and tertiary processes strip the phosphorus from the water, which is discharged into the sludge. So all that phosphorus builds up in the sludge. Currently, that sludge is then taken and spread to land, which is done. There is quite a lot of enforcement and legal requirements for how that's spread, to make sure it's spread to fields that need it, and that it's done in a way that's not going to pollute watercourses. But that is potentially then being moved to the other pathway, which is the overland flows. So increasing, one of the challenges is that increasing treatment of sewage to strip more phosphorus from the sewage doesn't actually remove phosphorus from the river catchment. You remove it from the sewage, you remove it from the discharge into the river, you're then moving it out to fields. So there's a risk that you're changing the pathway, but you're still making a way for phosphorus to make its way into the watercourses. This is obviously not a problem on fields that need phosphorus to grow crops, and it's really useful. Where it could be a problem is where those fields are already at very high levels of phosphorus, and the sewage sludge is then tipping it out, and you're again getting the leaching down through the watercourses. One of the solutions, one of the options then to trap some of this phosphorus and trap more additional phosphorus from watercourses and from sewage treatment work is through constructed wetlands, and there's a lot of talk and a lot of work going on for constructed wetlands at the moment. So this is taking essentially, you take the treated effluent that comes from a watercourse, rather than discharging it directly into a river, you discharge it into a wetland. You know how much it's very well monitored. So you know how much phosphorus is in that treated effluent that's coming out. It goes into a wetland. The plants within the wetland then use that phosphorus to grow. When they die, they sink to the bottom of the wetland and get stuck in the anaerobic conditions or lack of oxygen conditions, and that phosphorus is then locked away at the very bottom of the wetlands. If you create the wetland, design the wetland correctly so that you can increase the levels of water over time, you will eventually you can essentially lock that phosphorus away for a very long period of time. So this is why wetlands are being used specifically quite a good option for trying to mitigate new housing, because if you create a new wetland, you can measure how much phosphorus is entering it quite accurately, and then you can also lock that phosphorus away for a very long period of time, which you can't do with some of the other pathways. And then sort of the final pathway by which sewage and the phosphorus from sewage is making its way into watercourses is from sewer overflows. So the vast majority of the sewage system in the UK is built around a combined sewer system. So this means that all of the rainwater and all of the sewage goes into a single pipe, which goes to the sewage treatment works. As part of this system, to accommodate for very bad weather, overflows are built within it. So these overflows discharge are meant to discharge during heavy rainfall, and stop the when the sewage treatment works gets overwhelmed, to stop the sewage backing up into the house, and those overflows just go directly, raw sewage and rainwater goes directly into watercourses. This is obviously meant to be used in extreme conditions. I think probably everyone would agree, even water companies, that there's been an over-reliance on these systems, and the sewers are overflowing a lot more than they were probably designed to do, and probably a lot more than, well, personally, I would think is acceptable. If you visit a little shout out for the riverstrust.org/sewage map, you can see all of the CSOs in an area, and you can see which ones are discharging most and how much they're discharging for. Just recently, the data for 2023 came out, and so I was looking at it, and there was one sewage overflow on the Polford Brook, which is a brook which is suffering from excess phosphorus, and that sewage overflow was overflowing for 88 days in 2023. I mean, that to me is not extreme weather. That is an over reliance on that system. But these overflows are probably a pretty significant source of phosphorus in the river, particularly when they're discharging. Not only when they're discharging. So the solution is sustainable. Well, one of the solutions is sustainable urban drainage. This is looking at the drainage systems that are in our urban areas and trying to basically remove the clean water from the system to try and reduce the pressure on the sewage treatment works. So that's things like this is a photo in Sheffield where all of that runoff from that hard standing will go into that flower bed. There'll be a sort of an overflow from that flower bed, but it means during heavy rainstorms that water will more slowly percolate its way into the drains, and then from the drains into the sewage system. If it's more spread out, that should mean that we get less overflows. The other one that would make a big difference is large investment in sewage treatment works to increase their storm tank capacity. Most sewage treatment works have storm tanks, so that the first, they don't have to treat everything. They can store some of it and treat it slowly when the rainfall has stopped. Obviously, if you have more storage for storm tanks, that means you're more resilient to some of these heavy flows. Ultimately, it needs a pretty significant investment in our sewage systems to try and fix this problem. And then the final source of phosphorus, which we talk about at Welsh Dee Trust, we call the built environment. This is, if you go from the SAGES modelling, probably around 10% of the phosphorus in the River Dee is coming from this, which we call the built environment. There's essentially two pathways that we talk about when we're talking about this, which are mist connections and highway drains. But this is essentially where you have clean water discharges that go straight to a watercourse connected to either hard standing, such as roads, car parks, or connected to businesses or houses, and things are making their way into those clean water drains that are high in phosphorus, and that is making its way then into a watercourse. As an example, this is one on the River Dee. This is by Wrexham. So this is a clean water drain that goes into the River Grenfrew, which then goes into the River Dee. One of our citizen scientists has been monitoring the outfall from this clean water drain, getting intermediate to quite high levels of phosphorus coming from this drain, which is a clean water drain, intermittently, so it's not all the time, but every now and then they'll take a sample and there'll be very, very high levels of phosphorus coming from this. This drain connects to quite a large housing estate and also an industrial estate. It's been in place for a long time. The maps of where it goes to are a bit unclear because it would have been built probably in the it would have started in the 40s when they started building these drains, so it's not an entirely clear system where it all comes from. We have been doing some work with NRW and the citizen scientist and Wrexham Council, who own the drain, looking at potential sources. One thing that's come out clearly is at least an industrial estate. One of the businesses on the industrial estate was pouring quite. They had a drain connected up where they were pouring their cleaning products into a drain, which they didn't realise was actually a clean water drain. So that's a misconnection where they were pouring something down the sink. It was actually making its way into a clean water drain, which should have just been taking rainwater and off into this drain and eventually into the river. But I think that's probably one misconnection, but there'll be also a whole load of other domestic other businesses which are also probably pouring chemicals into those sorts of things. And so then the solution, the question is, what do you do about this? It's quite a hard one. I think a lot of it is around awareness raising, trying to identify where, make people more aware of different drains. So we have a target as part of our It Shouldn't Have Been a D program to try and improve 150 polluting drains. That's going to take the stages of either just drain marking, which is putting markers like this one on that you can see onto drains so that people know that it goes straight to the river, and then people hopefully won't pour stuff down it. But also I think SUDS and sustainable drainage plays an important part of this. They not only reduce the speed for which water moves through our urban areas, but they also, because it goes slowly, gives it more of a chance for a lot of these pollutants to fall out within the sort of retention basins. The biggest challenge is identifying which of the thousands and thousands of clean water drains that go into the River Dee from urban areas and built up areas are the ones that are causing damage. So that's where our citizen science will play a big role in essentially trying to identify where those drains are, so that we can start sort of awareness raising campaigns and focus our areas for our drain marking and our targets for SUDS. So yeah, hopefully you found that interesting. Thank you very much for listening. There is question and answers, so if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the question. I've seen one just come up, which I'll answer now in a second. I will, because I need, I'll be told off if I don't do it, but I need to give a shout out. Welsh Dee Trust, we are a small charity. We are independent. We get our funding from a wide variety of different sources, but ultimately funding is our biggest limiting factor for how much work we can do. And so we are very reliant on donations and fundraising as part of that work. And luckily, we have been selected next for the Big Give Green Match Fund. So this is running from the 18th to 25th of April this year. And every donation that's made to Welsh Dee Trust will be doubled. And I'm hoping our target is to try and raise £10,000, which will be donated, which will be doubled up to £20,000 and make a really significant impact. And all of that funding that we raise is going to go directly to our citizen science schemes and to our water-wise farming schemes to tackle sources of pollution in the River Dee. So please do keep an eye out for that, and if you'd like, and I'd be very thankful for any donations you receive. So yeah, I don't know if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question and answers, and they should pop up. I have seen one which comes from Patrick Taylor, which is a very good question. So it says, "Hi Peter, I undertake nutrient assessments. Does the trust sell the credits generated through farm improvements?" So it's a really good question. So part of, to give a bit of background on this for people who might not know, part of the challenge for new development is that if you are putting a new toilet building a new source of phosphorus, so a new toilet, which is putting additional pressure onto a sewage treatment works, you then have to identify a way to mitigate and take phosphorus out of the system in another way. And so they are called phosphorus credits, where essentially as a housing developer you have to pay to take phosphorus out of the river. There's a lot of work going on this. We have put a lot of thought into farm improvements and how that could be used to create phosphorus credits. The big challenge is to be able to produce a phosphorus credit, you have to be entirely sure of the amount of phosphorus that you're taking out of the system. When it comes to farms, it's a constantly fluctuating amount of pollution. You might not have any pollution for 2 years, and then a change, bad weather means that the livestock have to come indoors for a long time at this time of year, say, and you might have pollution that appears for 6 months. So it's very difficult to identify how much phosphorus you're actually stripping. And so because it's difficult to identify how much phosphorus you are actually taking out of the system by making those improvements on the farmyard, it makes it very difficult to then sell the phosphorus credits. That's sort of my understanding of it. I don't know if other people might have had more success doing that sort of work, but that makes it very challenging for those sort of farm improvements. That's why the wetlands is coming through as sort of the primary way of stripping phosphorus, because you have from the sewage treated effluent discharge, you have a pretty standard amount of phosphorus. It doesn't fluctuate that much during the year, and you can then measure the amount that goes into the wetland. You can measure the amount that comes out of the wetland, and from that you can get a very accurate idea of how much phosphorus you have stripped from the system. Oh god, there's loads of questions.
Then
so
the next, sorry, I was just going to say, Peter, the next one after Patrick was from Andrew. It's just below.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't see it. 2 seconds.
Okay, I'll read it out. I believe you have a water protection zone on the Dee. Has this helped your ability to clean up the river?
That is a good question. It has made a big impact on a lot of other chemicals and on industry within the River Dee. I would be very hard pushed to say it's had a major impact on phosphorus that I am aware of. That doesn't mean it hasn't, but I don't know if I could say it's had a big impact on phosphorus. Where I do know it's had a big impact is on industry that have tighter regulations to make sure they're compliant with various chemicals. The main risk being that because the Dee is such a major source of such a major source of drinking water, one major chemical spill could be quite devastating to the watercourse and to basically the drinking water of Liverpool, and so they have quite strict regulations around what they need to do. So it has had a big impact on water quality. Has it had such an impact on phosphorus? I'm probably not so sure.
Okay, there's another question from Henry Shepherd here. Hi Peter, aside from the modelling, is there any research data or evidence on the phosphorus contribution of different types of farms, such as dairy or poultry?
Oh, again, another good and difficult question. I don't know of any sort of modelling. I mean, there's almost definitely research, and I've visited a lot of different farms and I've read lots of different reports. I think the main challenge is that it's very different from farm to farm. So there's, broadly speaking, different industries. So dairy, poultry will have higher levels of phosphorus pollution coming from them, largely because they are more intensive and they have higher stocking rates. They do tend to have livestock in a yard area more, whereas obviously sheep farming, the sheep are spread out across the field for much longer periods of time. But I think the main thing is that it is a there's a big difference between each farm. So no two poultry farm, no two dairy farm is the same. And so I think trying to say any type of farm is worse than another isn't the right question, I guess. The right question is which of the individual farms are the largest source of pollution and phosphorus pollution. I think I've answered that question. I hope I have.
Okay. we've got another question from Joe Bradley. Do you find that the local authority, the water company and the regulators are able to and happy to work with you when you find a problem? I imagine that everyone has to be working together to see a real change.
Yes, I mean, we do work, so we work very closely with regulators, water companies. We have on the Dee, we have a Middle Dee catchment partnership, which brings together all the organisations to try and work more closely together. I think if we are to get significant change, working together is absolutely key. If nothing else, it's about knowing what everyone else is doing, so that we're not all replicating each other and wasting our energy. So yes, we do work together, and I think problems are fixed more easily and faster when we do work together. You know, I will be truthful, there is always challenges working with different organisations and different people, but that's part of the fun and games of partnership working, I guess.
Okay, I've got a few more questions. Still happy to go for it.
Yeah.
One question from Adam Dawson. Can you use a natural dye to identify which drain ends up where, or would that just add to the pollution?
You can do drain dye tracing, and I think there are natural ones that you can use. I'm not best placed to answer that question. I know there is a slight risk of causing pollution itself. I mean, it's one of those things. If it causes a little bit of pollution, but it solves an ongoing chronic pollution problem that's been ongoing for years, then you know it's probably for the best anyway. But yeah, I'm pretty sure there is sort of dye solutions out there for doing that.
Okay, got another question here. With the presumed change of government that will take place this year and the general acceptance that the EA and NRW are failing in their current model, how do you have expectations that resources for regulation will increase?
I don't know if I have expectations, but I hope they do. I think one of my key asks from government, from regulators, you know, Welsh Dee Trust, we are an independent organisation. There's lots of other independent organisations working out there on the challenge and the solutions. The one thing only the government can do is enforce regulations. No one else can do that. That has to be a government role. I think that needs to be the priority of government bodies and government. I think lack of enforcement over the last couple of decades is probably part of the problem why we've ended up in this situation with such poor water quality, both water companies and agricultural and road drains as well. And yeah, I'd like to see a huge amount of extra funding go into enforcement, and I think it's much needed. So I'd like to see an increase. I'd hope to. Yeah.
Okay, we've got another question here. Are you seeing any interest from green finance sources to pay for projects that will improve water quality in the Dee?
Yes, we are. The challenge is, I think there's a lot of interest. The challenge is around identifying the pathways to make sure that the money is invested correctly and is going to fix the problem, and making sure that the people making the investments are certain about what they're investing in. So there's quite a bit of work to do, and I know there's projects all over the UK that are probably further ahead of anything that I'm aware of in the Dee. One of the challenges in the Dee is it is in two different countries, so you've got sort of two different systems for trying to get green finance funding into the river, which also makes it quite challenging. Yep. Okay,
we've got a couple more questions. Is there much intensive farming along the Dee?
Yeah. The River Dee is probably some of the most fertile and best farmland, particularly the Cheshire Plains. It's got good rainfall, it's got good soils. It's probably some of the most fertile and best productive farmland in the UK, probably in the world actually. And so yes, there is, particularly, you know, Cheshire is a famous dairy farming area, and there's some quite large intensive dairy farms on the Dee. I will say, you know, agricultural pollution, in my experience, is not, you know, level of intensity isn't directly connected to levels of pollution. Some of the worst, you know, farms that are causing the most pollution, having the most issues, are actually very small, non-intensive farms. But because they haven't had the funding, haven't been making the money to invest in their business, the infrastructure's fallen down, and because of that, they get themselves into a difficult situation where they're causing pollution. And some of the farms that are absolutely the best, doing everything you could ask for, are some of the largest, more intensive farms. So I'm not sure, you know, there's probably a bit of a correlation between the intensivity of a farm and the amount of pollution it's causing, but it's not a clear-cut thing that the more intensive farm, the more likely it is to be causing pollution. It's much more down to sort of the individual business practices of each farm, I would say.
Okay, and the last question. Are you seeing a proliferation of slurry bags in the Dee catchment to manage slurry excesses? If so, what are your thoughts on these?
Slurry bags. I must admit, I don't know what a slurry bag is, apart from I think and I do know what I think I know what a slurry bag is. It's, you know, it's essentially store a large container for keeping slurry in. I think one of the solutions is, you know, there's chronic lack of storage for slurry on a lot of farms that we work with, and a lot of the problems on farms are led back to not having enough storage for slurry. The big challenge of that is that it costs a lot of money to build new slurry stores, new slurry lagoons or slurry towers, and to do it compliantly. If slurry bags are cheap and effective and compliant and not leaking way of storing slurry, then I think they'd probably be I'd sort of be quite happy. I'm much more worried about the stores that are 40 years old and are, you know, at the end of their life, and trying to work out ways to replace and restore them cost effectively. That makes sense. Excellent.
Okay, that's all the questions.
Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Hope you found it useful. Please, if you do want to keep up to date with the work of Welsh Dee Trust, make sure to follow us on social media. And yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you very much.